Our next speaker is Dr. Louis Kachur. Louis is professor of art history at Kean University and a scholar of Cubism, Surrealism, and American Modernism. Among his publications are Robert Rauschenberg transfer drawings from the 1960s and masterpieces of American Modernism from the Wilczek collection, co-authored with William Agee. He's also published essays on Magritte, Georges Braque, and Stuart Davis. A pioneer in the field of exhibition history and artists as curators, Louis completed a study of 50 years of exhibitions at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, New York. He is author of Displaying the Marvelous, Marcel Duchamp, Salvador Dali, and Surrealist Exhibition Installations. And he is currently at work on a companion volume, Displaying the Contemporary, Installation Art in New York Museums. In 2013, he spoke here at the Nasher in our 360 series on the subject of contemporary artists as curators. Louis's contribution to the Arp catalog explores Arp's approach to the display and exhibition of his work, and he draws from it for his talk today, Exhibiting Arp Between Abstraction and Surrealism. I think we're still waiting to get the PowerPoint up, but let's go ahead. Join me, please, in welcoming Louis Kachur.
Yes, happy to be back. And heartfelt thanks to Catherine Kraft and the Nasher for putting their energy and capital into this very elegant and wonderful, comprehensive exhibition upstairs, and also for creating a critical space for us all. And thank you all for coming to ponder Arp this morning. A for Arp is amazing when it comes to exhibitions. At times, he seems to be everywhere at once. During the Dada period, we of course associate him with the activities of Zurich, including exhibitions and performances. Yet within a short span of years, he was also showing with Dada in Berlin, Dada in Cologne, and Dada in Paris. Very cosmopolitan and international. He's the only other living artist in, let's see, this rather deliberately strange and bizarrely stylized group portrait, The Rendezvous of Friends, painted by Max Ernst in 1922. Ernst in green, or at least it looked green, is seated on the lap of cheekily on the lap of Dostoevsky, apparently pulling his beard. Behind him standing, his friend Arp extends a super long arm towards a toy football game, or foosball. I'd like to suggest that oversized arm is a metaphor for Arp's extraordinarily long reach in the art world. The others depicted here, significantly, are almost all poets and writers, centered on the red-caped André Breton in the middle, who was in the process of becoming the rather touchy pope of surrealism, and the writers Paul Éluard and Louis Aragon, who flank him. Arp was clearly comfortable among writers, indeed was quite a poet and writer himself. Once the surrealist writers began to accept visual artists into their movement, Ernst and Arp were among the first to be welcomed. So Arp was included in the first group exhibition of surrealism in 1925, followed by his own one-person exhibition at the Galeries Surrealistes in 1927. Yet soon, Arp turns up in Hanover, leaping countries and movements at a single bound. He's one of the first artists to show in his new constructivist friend El Lissitzky's abstract cabinet for the Hanover Museum, which commissioned designs for the most progressive rooms of contemporary art in the world at this moment. Arp shows only a small work, a drawing, presumably in the cases in the lower picture, but it's no small matter, I think, to be included alongside Lissitzky, Mondrian, Moholy-Nagy, and the like in this landmark of installation design. And as we saw, and if you look upstairs, Arp collaborated with Liszewski in that wonderful little book, Kunstism. So too, jumping another border to Switzerland, Arp participates in a exhibition surveying Paris production in the year 1930 at Zurich's Gallery Wolfsburg. Arp is interestingly paired here with Piet Mondrian in, I think, a very effective wall. Arp's rounding and curved forms a contrast to the rectilinear squares of Mondrian, of course, and contrasting between flat planes of Mondrian and Arp's shallow relief, between tableau and relief, and also between projecting and recessive frames. Both artists also used white spaces and blanks very extensively and effectively. In the same year of 1930, Arp also appears back in Paris in the newly formed Cercle et Carré, or Circle and Square, only first and last group exhibition. And Arp is there, hat in hand, literally, besides Mondrian, Torres Garcia, Sophie Tauber Arp is there, and Kandinsky at the far right. I haven't been able to locate an installation view which shows Arp's own works on view at Cercle et Carré, but as a substitute, Sophie Tauber Arp's Wahlberger Krupp has kindly identified this as Sophie Tauber Arp's work Café, and the general view gives an idea of the rather crowded and salon-style hanging of Cercle et Carré. The group soon morphed into a longer-lasting association, Abstraction-Creation, and with its alphabetical publications, A for Arp always comes first in the catalog periodical. And although Arp exhibited with Abstraction-Creation from 1931 to 1934, I haven't been able to find any installation views of his works, but there are very few altogether. Among the very rare ones that we have are Bettina Bill, Max Bill's wife, photographing the 1933 exhibition in Paris here, which shows us the same kind of salon-style double hanging, rather crowded on the wall, and also shows fairly open acceptance of abstraction in forms both geometric and organic or biomorphic together. While an enthusiastic member of Abstraction-Creation, Arp appears elsewhere in Paris in the same year in a surrealist exhibition staged at the Galerie Pierre Colle in June of 1933. Sculptural works were prominent in this show. These are two installation views. Examples by Jacques Amedi appear, as well as three-dimensional works by artists less known for sculpture, such as Ernst, Yves Tanguy, and at the right you see Salvador Dali, including his retrospective bust. Man Ray shot some 9 photos of this show, among the first, apparently the very first surrealist exhibition to be so completely documented. And on the left, Arp's 2 plaster concretions, among his earliest, are photographed from slightly above on a rather low base by Man Ray, and together sharing space with a small object by Max Ernst. And from the exhibition, we recognize our friend, 3 disagreeable objects on a face here as the smaller of the concretions. And indeed, it was perhaps Arp's most prominent sculpture in this early phase of his 3-dimensional production, in that it was also reproduced in the prestigious journal Cahiers d'Art in that very same year, where it was termed, interestingly, a sculpture poésie, a fusion of media, I think very appropriate to Arp, and which brings me to the thought that the title of the work is actually part of his poésie, or poetry. The photographs in Cahiers d'Art are more moody, emphasizing malleability of the elements to the point where some have mistaken the 2 photos as being of 2 different sculptures, but actually they are rearranged parts of 3 disagreeable objects. The upper one is the closest to man rays, but even here, the mandolin form is changed from the neck of the mandolin pointing inwards to pointing outwards in that photograph. So the pieces have been moved around. As we know, they're not fixed to the lower sculpture / base. Arp, so as documented by these early photographs, Arp emphasizes the non-fixity and mutability of all 4 pieces of 3 disagreeable objects. Still, the continuing thread of abstraction is signaled by a number of exhibitions, including Arp's participation with Max Bill's mostly abstract Alliance group show in Zurich in 1937. But unsurprisingly, back in Paris the same year, Arp works are also included in the stock of André Breton's new commercial venture, the Gallery Gordiva on the Rue de Seine. More memorably, Breton rallied the Surrealists in the winter of 1937 for a spectacular, huge group exhibition that took place in a much more traditional gallery, the Wildenstein-owned Galerie Beaux-Arts. The group turned the plush rooms of Wildenstein into a surrealist environment with unexpected installations beginning before you even got into the exhibition, with Salvador Dali's full-scale, ready-made The Rainy Taxi lurking outside in the courtyard in front of the gallery. Once inside that door, you passed through a very long hallway that the Surrealists took as an occasion to reform into a Surrealist street and had 16 artists and writers dress or stage department store mannequins with additional objects. And the very first in the row was Arps, in this case, a place which was not apportioned to him by alphabet, but a kind of honor. And subverting that honor, Arp rather singularly covered his mannequin in black and white cloths so that only the hands and the feet protrude. The most arresting feature is the printed word "pas papillon" in large block capitals near where the face would be. But we don't make eye contact, we make word contact. And it's a bit of a puzzle. The invented word, "pas papillon," the word papillon for butterfly gets an extra pas, then embedding or doubling the word papa into it, and thus punning on Papa Butterfly, a rather unexpected association of nature in this indoor context. Seemingly a modest gesture, but one which resists the repetitive fetishization of the female body, which is the main trope and repeats throughout most of the other 15 mannequins. Sometimes more subtly, as with Yves Tanguy's mannequin right next to Arps, other times in greater extreme, as in the case of André Masson's here on the left, which is gagged and sports a stripper's G-string, or with Dali's, which is fashionably clad in a Schiaparelli ski mask. Instead of the body, Arp redirects us to the word and to the role of his writings, which have only become clear to me, in fact, since Eric Robertson's book. So I now believe it's telling that Arp is close to a wall-mounted bookbinding in the box there by his friend Georges Junier, a binding of Raymond Roussel's experimental novel Locus Solus of 1914, which is also arranged interestingly on the spine there, and visible at the same level or the same line of text as "pas papillon." The coinage "pas papillon" is a stanza from a longer poem called Bestiary with No First Name that goes through various animals, and that will be published by André Breton in his anthology of black humor shortly thereafter. In the poem, Papa Butterfly, as you see here, is halfway, Papa Papillon is halfway between butterfly and grandfather butterfly in a kind of generational progression. And the second pa is also stuffed into empaillé, which means stuffed, so empapaillé gets the same humorous treatment. And Arp altogether creates a kind of sing-song rhythm here in his rather lighthearted verses that have a very different tone from the much heavier tone of the other mannequins in the exhibition. So I think Arp is substantially aligning himself here with the Surrealist writers more than with the Surrealist artists. Indeed, he would create a collaborative work with Hunier elsewhere in the exhibition. Arp was one of a number of artists who was given a mini retrospective in the exhibition proper. In the second room, once you pass through Duchamp's famous coal sack room, were grouped 4 Arp pieces in a really astonishing range of media, flanking Breton's curious contribution of this chest object on legs, a kind of exquisite corpse in 3 dimensions, and 3 paintings by the Belgian surrealist René Magritte. Apart from the rather erotic connotations of Crown of Buds, which is owned by Hunier, the other 3 Arp works in this cluster constitute a surprisingly politicized group which all refer to contemporary events. They're all hung higher up so that they cross-talk across the upper part of the room. On the left is the papier-mâché, mutilated and stateless, now framed as a wall relief where it had been exhibited without the box on a glass shelf in the famous 1936 Charles Retton Gallery Surrealist Exhibition of Objects. Across the room, just visible in the upper right, speaks to, I think, in the upper right, the collaborative work that Arp made with Hunier, which shows a floating cage stuffed with cotton, meant to suggest clouds. It rhymes with the cage body of Magritte's painting, The Therapist, just across, but with a very different meaning. The title, essentially, The Prisoner, associates it to warfare and reminds us that the civil war in Spain was raging at this time. And just to the right of the Magritte Therapist is another boxed Arp relief, which is just out of the field of the Breitenbach photo, a little-known work called Gamut Sawdust. It's visible in this press photograph just above Magritte's weightlifter here, and in a color of the same piece. Gamut Sawdust is, in fact, poetry by Arp, a limited edition presented here without the cover, and instead affixed inside the wooden box with 6 nails rather aggressively punched through the title page. Like the caged clouds, they suggest restraint or even repression of the free, perhaps a metaphorical comment on a fascist censorship of language and poetry in these years. The book cannot be opened, of course. Arp poems remain unread. And I am intrigued on a material level that Picasso used nails, a kind of unusual artist material, in this relief guitar of 1926. Language is form. In Mutilated and Stateless, to go back across the room, where Arp has covered the headline that is the title, Mutilé et apatride, which pops out because of the covering of the other text pages. Some of the texts in this papier-mâché speak of the German militarization of parts of the Rhineland, a menacing development on the European stage, which would have been troubling to one born in Strasbourg. Apatride, or stateless, certainly could apply to Arp himself, at least at an earlier point in his life, and in the story that we just heard of his reaction to World War I. The 1938 Surrealist exhibition was a landmark, perhaps the most important exhibition of the first half of the 20th century, and was, as such, very widely photographed and written about in the international press. From the right-wing French nationalist press, which labeled the show as disturbingly non-French because of including so many foreign-born artists, to the communist press, which found it a cop-out and too dream-obsessed rather than social-political. But I think they missed what ARP was doing here in this group of works, a subtle yet distinct politicized response to the widespread politicization of that moment, in which a European conflict was widely predicted. Here, I think, is the pacifist, anti-nationalist ARP that we've spoken of already, and all too relevant to our own politicized times. The Paris Surrealist exhibition was in part motivated to self-define surrealism as a riposte to the Museum of Modern Art's earlier pioneering effort. 7 years after the MoMA opened its building, director Alfred Barr staged 2 vast exhibitions that attempted to broadly survey the 3 decades of achievement of modernism. Both exhibitions included a substantial number of works by ARP. The first, Cubism and Abstract Art, opened in the spring of 1936 and includes the Société Anonyme's wonderful Birdman here, which is in the exhibition. Oh, what did we lose? Well, maybe nothing important. Barr tellingly, I think, paired the volumetric forms of Picasso's painting of a bather with the swelling forms of an Arp-Concretion nearby. Half a year later, the sequel opened, Fantastic Art, Dada, Surrealism. And here, 3 ARP reliefs take pride of place on the title wall of the exhibition, almost as if suggesting ARP himself could define all those terms, Fantastic Art, Dada, Surrealism, with his 3 reliefs. The catalog at the desk, one notice, is also open to the ARP page, showing 2 other ARPs in the exhibition. Of the 4 works that we can see, and it looks pretty much like a white wall. What do you think? Barr also used monk's cloth, I believe, but in some rooms for texture, but I think this is not that. The 4 works include 2 that are in the exhibition upstairs and the mountain navel that Tessa just spoke of. So ARP, like Picasso, was generously represented in both Barr's shows. Though many of us, including myself, has assumed that Barr's exhibitions were a contrasting pair of opposite groups, it seems clear that Barr saw them as more provisional, overlapping, and fluid rather than rigid in designation. In fact, it's very surprising to learn that fully 20 artists were included in both Cubism and Abstract Art and Fantastic Art, Dada, Surrealism. So clearly, ARP was not alone in erasing or crossing stylistic so-called boundaries. So as I've tried to outline, ARP cultivated an exhibition career and a vital presence among both abstract and surrealist colleagues. He was for independence, even hybridity. So I wonder if this fact actually applies to his delightful 2 thoughts on a navel. On the most literal level, we all want to think of those 2 smaller blue-green forms as the thoughts, because there's 2 of them, but thoughts are evanescent, forms are solid, so there's a disconnect and room for another association. ARP was clearly capable of keeping 2 thoughts in his head at the same time. So, time's up. So, just a minute to finish. Might not their thoughts be, those 2 thoughts be on some level abstraction and surrealism? And doesn't the piece itself, in fact, embody or solidify this duality? Especially since, again, the parts are malleable, so it could be moved into more physiognomic or more non-representational configurations. We can't do that now under the glass, but I do recommend you move around the vitrine in the exhibition and try to find the most abstract view and the most surrealist one. You can do it. And these 2 movements, of course, in our art history textbooks, rather ossify these movements into separate chapters. But shouldn't we allow for the relativity of ARP and reinstate the fluidity and even the hybridity that is, in fact, the nature of ARP. Thank you. Questions?
I would like to suggest that you do humor and art together.
Yes.
Okay, you have a great sense of humor. Great presentations.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
I'm really interested in what your view is of the present installation, which looks very much more like the MoMA installations than like the earlier ones you showed.
Then which earlier ones?
The surrealist, all of them. They're all of them are.
Except for Alfred Barr, you mean?
Except for Alfred Barr, yeah. And except for the one with Mondrian and the reliefs on the same wall with a very dark wall.
Yeah.
Which I'm curious what color it is actually, and one doesn't know from the photographs.
Yeah, and I don't. You know, Catherine, what they color the walls at the Gallery Wolfsburg. It's a beautiful view. I guess, as Catherine was saying on the tour yesterday, there's questions of light levels, the question of trying to establish a chronology among disparate spaces and even upstairs and downstairs. But I guess Barr's vision of MoMA is really, as you know, very much establishes the white cube that we pretty much has been powerful and persistent, and I think probably up through Renzo Piano as well, except where you have the windows onto nature, which is such a great thing to have for an artist like Arp. Not sure if that answered your question.
Well, it sort of did.
I
I think it's one of the most beautiful installations I've ever seen, and I think that it actually combines elements of the salon style, multiple works, and the sort of purity or pseudo purity of the MoMA installations, which is what's interesting to me about it. There's a sense in which the works on the wall, sometimes hung at eye level, sometimes above, different media on one wall has a kind of it really pushes one to think comparatively in ways rather than the chronological thing of one thing at a time. And I think that I think there's a lot from your earlier installations slides that Catherine took into account when installing the exhibition here. Also, can I just
Maybe
ask,
we should ask her, did you take those into account when you were, or did you have enough to deal with just the works?
Yeah. The other thing I want to say is I'm very interested, as many people know, in the history of installations, and many art historians are beginning to deal with this rather neglected topic. I would wish, in what I tend to find in published articles that deal with the history of installations, that the installation photographs are very small on the page, which is exactly the wrong thing to do, because they represent big spaces and big things. And when we privilege the single work of art with a huge illustration and the installation shot with a tiny one, then they don't work. So, an observation.
When I wrote Displaying the Marvelous, I kind of faced that with the MIT Press, and we wanted to include so many illustrations that they became on the small side. And then some subsequent publications which went to the very same photo sources, then only blew them up as full pages, which was nice and looked quite different, but it was sort of interesting to see as a response. I guess it depends on the publisher and the largesse of illustration and photo permission funds.
And one more question.
You referred a couple of times to the word consecration.
Concretion.
Concretion. What is the definition?
That's kind of a general term that Arp used sometimes in his titles, but this is one here. For those, he started to use those in the title in the mid-30s rather than these naming object titles for those plaster works. But my question for you is this in fantastic art, go wrong way, the same as that? Well, that's a question that got to me when I got here and didn't have my catalogs on hand to check the titles. Looks similar, and then these are both either the same or two variant of the body of three-dimensional works that are often referred to generally as concretions and sometimes specifically titled as concretions. Yeah, well, it kind of to show that expansion and swelling, yeah. I love it with the Picasso. It's kind of hilarious, but also there's something of a period style there, since that's a later Picasso. It's not so far, I think late 20s, similar time frame to the Arp concretion.
Thank you.
Okay.